Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Freeman Jack on People's Internet Radio. Yes, I am live. We'll be discussing adult topics with adult language. Any opinions expressed will be purely my own, will not reflect on any other hosts or opinions expressed by the radio station. I'm definitely on a better late than never trip tonight. I was actually on stream at 7:30 when I got an urgent business call to have to go and see a client that only had a very short time available to be able to discuss a business matter that we've been waiting quite a while to attend to, or to at least get an agreement. Looks like I'm a bit quiet there again. What the bloody hell's going on here? I'm just going to wind this mic up a little bit. Let me try that. 1, 2, 3. Gridlock, our business meeting, Gridlock, and then Electro-Meteorology was supposed to be the topic of tonight's show. I think I'll still have a bash at it as it goes. I think what I'll probably do is I'll shunt Omniversity to next week, because I don't know how much I've got on this Electro-Meteorology, really. It's a bit of a new component to my electrobiology, but a couple of things happened to lead me down this new avenue. I had a flashback, a real distinct memory of an occasion when I was walking back to my trailer in the woods in Lambhurst Forest, in Lambhurst Quarter, and I was coming out of my friend's house in Lambhurst, about 2 miles down the hill from where my caravan was, and it was the most pitch black night. The moon was new, and because of the late hour it was completely over the horizon, so there was no moon in the sky, not even a new moon. The sky was absolutely crystal bright, thousands of stars, but not particularly, casting any particular sort of starlight on the ground. And the nearest town being Tunbridge Wells, and over the sort of crest of the hill and down in the dip, really, unless there were any low-lying clouds, shone no light onto this scene at all. Anyway, I take my usual sort of shortcut across the field. And the open field isn't too bad. There's just about enough light for your eyes to sort of collate an image and to be able to make out the path from the grass on either side. But having crossed this stile into a sort of farmer's lane that I'd use, I was entering quite sort of dangerous territory. This was a bow arch, tree-covered concrete track, like a tractor track, and I used it quite frequently, but not very frequently. But I knew that all the way down one side of it was a sheer 9-foot drop into a sort of a ditch. It was actually a running river, but a narrow river, sort of a gully, and that this concrete track dog-legged by about 60 degrees at some point under the sort of tree bow arch. And as me and the dog are approaching this sort of tree bow arch, all of the light is now completely eliminated. And I don't know if you've ever sort of put yourself into a darkened room with all the sort of curtains drawn and put the lights out and realised just how dark can be if you actually exclude every single source of light. But it was essentially one of these situations. So I now find myself having to negotiate my way down probably a 300-yard concrete tractor track with this sheer 9 feet drop off to the left-hand side, and the bend was to the right, so if anything you were just going to like sort of walk off the edge, you wouldn't even know that you were approaching it. You'd just take one step and it'd be a bit of a long drop. Anyway, I got a few steps into this tunnel, and even the dog was so blind, he was like freaking out and actually sort of trying to hide behind my legs. It was so dark the dog didn't even know what to do. I don't think he'd ever experienced anything quite that dark. And I'll stop and try and let my eyes sort of acclimatise to the dark. And nothing really much happened. I hold my hand up in front of my face and literally at arm's length I couldn't see my hand. But then I realised that I sort of can make out my hand by its outline, but it's outlined completely by blackness. And then my eyes begin to sort of fall in a little bit more, and I realise that it's not that it's surrounded by complete inky blackness. It's surrounded by complete inky blackness with loads of little blue lights. And sort of as I sort of realise that I'm able to see these blue lights, I look up and around me in this sort of tree bow arch and realise that the entirety of this tree arch is kind of bioluminescent. It was covered in these little bright blue glowing dots. And initially, obviously, I suspected that it was just simply a psychoactive function of some chemical or other that I'd been taking that evening. But I realised that when I held my hand up in front of this illumination, that I could block it out and make out the shape of my hand by its shadow against it. So this is kind of sort of identified that this is something external to me. And I basically used this light. I still couldn't see the concrete path or the sheer drop to my side at all. But because of this bioluminescence coming off of these trees, I was able to see the sort of shape of the sort of tunnel that covered over the path, and was able to navigate my way safely down the path. Anyway, it really struck me. I'd never seen this sort of thing before. I'd heard of sort of sea foam bioluminescing, and I knew that various sort of fungi and that. I realised that some fungi and that naturally bioluminesce, and there's a few other things that produce essentially a phosphorescent luminescence. But most bioluminescence, phosphorus luminescence in any case, is nearly all kind of a luminous day-glow green and not this intense blue colour that I saw. And I essentially put it down to perhaps, you know what I mean, that these trees maybe had some sort of a mould on them, and because of the darkness of the night I was able to see the bioluminescence of the mould, or that perhaps somehow the trees were bioluminescing through some sort of chemical process that I was previously unaware of. But the fact never left my head. The question never left my head. And then I'm watching some of the latest Thunderbolts uploads to YouTube, and two in particular. And they're both on the subject of this Sapphire project that they've been running, which is essentially a huge vacuum chamber, like a big cast iron, like an iron lung, but a giant cast iron pressure cylinder. And they can evacuate this thing to almost zero atmosphere, like absolute vacuum. And it's set up with a high tension, high voltage anode in the middle of it. And by varying the voltages and the mixtures of the trace gases in the what's left of the atmosphere in there, and by varying the pressures and other sort of parameters, they're essentially looking for the plasma sun model, the electric sun model, is what they're looking for data on specifically. But I'm watching their anode behaviour and all the various field effects that they're noticing around it, and that they're busy comparing to the sun and thinking about the sun, and it's the sun. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking, and it's all the stuff that I was postulating in my initial electrobiology theory about the nature of plasma, especially cold plasma. Cold plasma is essentially plasma that's not luminescent. It doesn't have any current flowing, and so the photons, the electrons, don't get excited enough to turn into photons. So hot plasma is, you know what I mean, flame, electric arc, lightning, all of those sort of things. And while I'm watching one of these sort of demonstrations of this thing, they're actually approaching normal atmospheric pressure. They're actually depressurizing, vacuumizing, I suppose, repressurizing the chamber while maintaining the current onto the anode. And as these various pressure thresholds are reached, this anode develops a plasma sphere. Initially the one, and then many, and then these spheres become sort of unstable and begin to interact with each other, and then finally collapse. And I realised that what I was seeing there in front of my eyes was the very representation of what I'm suggesting atmospheric electrics is all about, because we're really given a model, an atmospheric model, that is all about heat and evaporation and air currents. Well, I started to think about clouds and air currents and things, and I actually went in and did a bit of the science and went and looked at the standard model of sort of cloud formation and water vapour evaporation and upcurrents and all this sort of caper. And obviously I had a fair grounding in all of this. I was pretty comfortable with all of the sort of primary theory anyway. But I sort of went and checked anyway, and sure enough, I sort of was reasonably confirmed in what I found, in as much as the way that the water from the floor gets to the sky and into the clouds and then back down is, according to their books, something called vapour pressure, which is simply the Brownian motion, the heat motion within a fluid, knocking out little spits of the liquid into free air, and that this liquid, once it's sort of spat out into the free air with such a small molecule, is able to draw enough heat from the surrounding air in order to be able to change state from liquid to gas. This is the creation of water vapour. Well, water vapour in just about any context is a colourless, odourless gas. In other words, it's invisible. So this invisible water vapour is now reckoned to be being sort of heated by the sun, regardless of whether the sun's shining or not, and carried up on currents of air. Now, bearing in mind also that water vapour is less dense than oxygen and nitrogen combined, so it would be lighter than the air at sea level. However, as it rises up through the atmosphere, it begins to experience a reduction in pressure and a reduction in temperature, which means that it condenses the energy that was taken on board to convert it from a liquid to a gas in the first place, is now being robbed by the environment, and so it converts back to a liquid. So now you've got this liquid form of H2O in the air. Well, liquid H2O is heavier than air and would just simply fall straight back out again. And we're told, this is how the model works, is that updrafts in the air currents carry this water vapour so high into the sky that when it condenses, the continuing updraft from the ground, from the evaporating water and the buoyancy of the air, is somehow acting through this cloud and pushing the forming droplets of water, rather than water vapour, which is a gas, liquid water, and recirculating them through the cloud as droplets of water that sort of crash into each other and end up falling to earth when they finally acquire enough size. And this is supposed to explain like 1,000 tons of water hanging in the sky as liquid water. And if you've ever sort of been through a storm cloud in a light plane or whatever, and seen just how heavy that water is hitting the windshield, and how it's not being blown up through the bloody cloud. If this was the case, essentially clouds would have to be like donut shaped. They would have to be toroidal. They would have to have a sort of vortexing centre with constantly circulating sort of crown and sides and base. And this just simply isn't the case. And I suddenly realised that with this anode experiment, in this sapphire experiment, what you're actually seeing there is a mechanism for a electric charge to move through an environment without inducing a current. There would be some current induced, but you get into some really exotic sort of electrical theory when you start talking about sort of moving plasmas through space. Essentially, unless the plasma is in glow mode, then you'll have an ionized condition in the gas, which has an electrical potential, but until that electrical potential is discharged to some other sort of equal and opposite electrical potential, then there's no current, so there's no magnetic field and there's no light given off. There's not really any way to detect it. But it's my suggestion that the Earth is that anode, that the Earth is a positively charged sphere, and it sits underneath one of these. I really should have pulled up the. I'll tell you what. After I put the next tune on, I'll line up one of these Thunderbolts videos to just the right spot and drop it in the chat, so you can just have a little look at what it is that I'm talking about here, because it's quite hard to describe. But essentially, the inner atmosphere, the inside of the upper atmosphere, will be essentially a cathode. That anywhere that there's an anode, the charges will separate and will balance. And let me chuck a tune on, find this video, so at least some of you will have the slightest idea what I'm talking about. If you follow the second link in there that I just dropped in the chat there, right, that's Lowell, what's his name? Lowell Morgan at the Sapphire Project. His experiments with this Sapphire Project, and you can clearly see these sort of spheres of plasma coming off of this anode, and essentially to explain what's happening there is, if you can imagine that were like a common or garden plasma ball, one of these sort of disco balls that you can get, that the lightning sort of comes out the thing in the middle and hits the glass on the outside, and if you put your hand on it, it all comes to your hand, and if you play music, it kind of reacts to the music and all that sort of caper. Well, that's what should be happening here if the current was at a threshold in order to ionise the space in between. But because this is a reduced pressure environment, and because the voltages are quite high and the amperages are quite low, we're seeing these sort of plasma effects that I'm suggesting the atmosphere does actually consist of. And in fact, it's probably the riding of these plasma layers, the boundaries between them riding over each other, that's probably the force that drives the winds that we see, because often winds go opposite directions at different altitudes. So what I'm suggesting is that the H2O, the water vapour, is an electrical dipole, and that having been carried a certain distance up into the sky, that if you were to hold a strong north pole of a bar magnet under, say, a plastic sort of bar tray or something, and then slowly advance a north pole of another bar magnet towards that north pole, that as you approach, the nearer you got, the greater a resistance you would feel. And you can think of this akin to pushing a roller coaster cart up the roller coaster hill, and as you breach the sort of midpoint of the magnetic field, the magnetic repulsion, that you'll now be propelled down the other side in much the same way that as you push the roller coaster ride, sort of train car, over the top of the hill. Now all of the energy that was stored up in kinetic form on the way up is now released on the way down, and essentially the absolute top of that roller coaster hill is actually a null zone. So you're if you were to stop at just the right spot, you wouldn't go backwards, you wouldn't go forwards, you would just stay in that area. And what it looks like is that in nature there are all of these sheaths of plasma of alternating polarity, possibly, or direction. Plasma sheaths going up into the atmosphere, not just the ones at the sort of upper atmosphere and then the ionosphere, zootroposphere, and all the rest of them, but literally all the way from the ground up. And that once a pocket of water vapour has been carried up beyond that sort of threshold point, that null zone between the charged states of the ground and of the air, the electric dipole of the H2O is effectively going to be attracted upwards, and so we have an electromagnetic force that's actually pulling the water up, and once it's up there it begins to condense, it begins to cool, as I said before, and it begins to turn into water droplets, and now we have a completely different substance. We have H2O, but by this point, if it's high enough up in the air, it's entirely likely that the electric force is incredibly strong, absolutely ridiculously strong. I've presented some of this evidence in some of my Omni shows, and so a large high voltage charge above the cloud will essentially hold the cloud against gravity as long as that charge remains constant. So as this cloud is travelling over the topography underneath, we have a rising and falling electrical potential field as the ground rises under the atmosphere and under the cloud, as the cloud travels over, say, a hill or whatever, that now the distance between the ground positive, the ground anode, and the sky cathode is being shortened, and as a consequence the actual voltage of that circuit is reduced. The voltage is induced by the huge distance involved, by the 5 kilometres. It actually looks like it's in excess of 500,000 volts just from the ground to the sky. Possibly even greater. That's I would suggest that the 400,000 volts constant potential, which is probably the best estimate that I've been able to find yet from an academic, I personally think is a massive underestimate. Essentially, it's impossible to measure this. Anything that hasn't got current flowing through it, none of our devices of measuring electricity really work. So, anyway, I haven't rounded this theory off. It's got lots of sharp edges on it. I need to hone it a little more. It's something that I just stumbled on recently, and with that kind of memory of the sort of bioluminescing plants, I thought I'd like to bring it to the fore. And seeing as we're in a better late than never productions today, I think I'm going to go ahead with my Omni that I'd planned. So I'll just throw on a quick tune, fill up my cup of tea, and we'll go into magnet.